All right, I know we've got some people showing up. Welcome, welcome. We're going to get started here. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes and then we'll go right into the training. Great to see some familiar names from Simplicity's headquarters staff and some awesome consultants and some unknown names. That's great. Welcome, everybody. I don't know about you guys, but I could use a little training in resilience right now. Super excited to have everybody joining. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Okay. All right. Well, hey, welcome everybody. We are here for a fabulous workshop titled Taming the Sabertooth, Thriving in Turbulent Times. I'm Carrie Morris, Vice President of Client Services, Marketing and Operations for Simplicity Consulting. We are an enterprise marketing consultancy for this new world of work. We help clients achieve their goals with on-demand consultants that specialize in brand building, lead generation, modern storytelling, sales channel ignition, and business optimization. Gives me great pleasure to introduce everybody to the fabulous speaker that we have here today, Tracey Grove. Hi, Tracey.
Okay.
Tracey is an author, speaker, and coach. She specializes in leadership effectiveness, helping executives from diverse lines of business all over the world deal with individual and interpersonal issues, communication challenges, and organizational shifts. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Tracey. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much, Carrie. Appreciate the welcome and happy to be with everybody today. So we're talking about taming the sabertooth. And the reason that we think about this as a sabertooth is we're talking about stress. And we all know at the moment that stress is on the rise, it's rampant. It's particularly right now, over the last year and a half, people have been really struggling with stress. And so one of the things we want to do today is to think about how we can nurture our recovery from stress, how we can think about how we overcome the fear that is so much a part of our lives right now, and then also how we think about dominating those distractions that we deal with every day. We've got so much on our plates, so much happening in the world around us, and how we can actually become more effective, how we can become more focused, and also how we can just become happier and calmer and healthier as a result. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we tame the saber-tooth of stress and thrive in times of change? In spite of change, how can we thrive? I like to think about resilience in a certain way. So resilience arises out of a belief in our own efficacy. So it's our ability to deal with change and the use of a repertoire of problem-solving skills. So the big words here for me are belief and dealing with change and skills. So what we have learned from lots of research into resilience is that a lot of it is about your belief in your own capability. Also, the good news is resilience is a muscle, so we can build it. And it's not necessarily something that we have to be born with or not born with. So when we think about stress, it's a bit of a paradox. The interesting thing about stress is that we need it. Our brains need some form of stress to activate. So we can't actually think, we can't perform, we can't do anything in our lives. Our brains can't function unless there is some form of activation and some form of stress. The key is that that stress has to be short-lived. When you think about animals in the wild, they live in what is called acute stress. Now, acute stress is a very quick increase in stress and then a very quick decrease in stress. So let's say there's a gazelle or an antelope that is being chased by a lion. While they're being chased by the lion, their stress is activated. So they'll run, they'll do whatever they have to do to escape. Once the lion gives up and doesn't catch the antelope goes back to grazing. The stress level comes right back down again. They come straight back to normal. Now that's all very well in the animal kingdom. The sad thing for humans is that we deal with stress in the same way as the animal kingdom, but we are dealing with chronic stress. So it's not a very short-lived quick peak of stress. It's an ongoing chronic level of low-level stress and sometimes high-level stress. What happens when we have stress that goes on for a long period of time is we don't get to this peak performance peak here in the middle of the slide. Instead, we come down the other side and we start to become fatigued. We become exhausted. This is where we start to get sick, where we find disease happening. So you get burnout happening when you have the constant stress. So it's very important that stress is short-lived and that we can then release that stress and get rid of it. And the only way we can do that is by moving through it. So when we think about endings, grieving, any kind of trauma, any change that we deal with, that from our brain's perspective is a form of trauma that is grieving. So we go through over time think of this as I think of it almost as a roller coaster ride. So think of it as a moving through the stress curve, if you like. So our performance dips and then increases as we go through the curve. In stage one, this is where we're dealing with things like denial. Maybe we're grieving for something. Maybe something's changed. Maybe, we've all had this to deal with over the last year and a half. Our way of life has changed. We've had to end the way we think about working, about being at home with children, with parents, with family members. We haven't been able to see people. That's a form of grief and a form of trauma to our brain. We then move through this confusion stage where we might be feeling the shock and the realization of what's actually happening. And so that's very normal to feel confused, to feel a little bit nonplussed by the situation. Often then, as we move through the curve, we might become angry. We start to blame other people for things. We might be resistant to whatever the shift is, whatever the change is. And all of this has to happen before we can then come into the dip. And that's when we let go. Letting go is the most important part of this whole process, because as we let go, we then move into stage two, which is the transition stage. And stage two is where the gold is. Stage two is where we start to reckon with the change, with the fact that the reality that we're dealing with is no longer the same as it was. But we're starting to let go of the fact that we want to hold on to that reality. We're starting to look forward to the future. When we start to do that, as we start to come out of this curve over time, we do start to feel a little anxiety, maybe some frustration and some fear, because it's now a little bit of more of an unknown. We're starting to actually see the unknown and face it. But as we continue to step into that space and move through that fear, we start to feel optimism again. We start to understand, what does the new world look like? What does the new situation look like? What do I look like in this new scenario? What role am I playing? There's understanding that comes from this stage. And with that understanding, you start to see the opportunities, start to see the possibilities of the new beginning. And then as we finally go through the end of the curve, that's when we start to see acceptance, commitment to the new beginning, the new way of doing things, the new way of working, the new way of interacting with friends and family. The enthusiasm comes when we start to see the possibilities of this actually being a good thing and not necessarily being as horrible as we thought it was. And that's when we start to see trust building as well. So we all go through this curve, and we will go through this curve every time there's any kind of ending for our brains. Our brains have to go through this process because they're actually sorting through the information in order to understand what's happening for us. And it's important to understand that it's okay to feel these things. It's also okay to feel like you might go backwards in the curve sometimes. Maybe you're feeling optimistic and feeling pretty good about things. Something happens and you go back to resistance, or maybe you're feeling more shock and confusion. It's okay. It's all right to acknowledge those emotions and then be able to move through. The interesting thing about this, though, is that our perception influences our reaction to events. So we've all heard of Pavlov's dog. So we know that Pavlov, a really interesting scientist, took a lot of dogs and he tapped into their salivary glands, and he trained the dogs to associate the bringing of food with the ringing of a bell. So when the dogs over time would hear a bell ring, they would then anticipate food and would start to salivate. He realized that he had been able to associate two things to enable the reaction of the dogs. He also understood that you could extinguish that association. So over time, he also taught these dogs to disassociate the ringing of the bell with the bringing of food, because he took away the bell and he would bring the food. He would ring the bell and he wouldn't bring food. So the dogs started to break the connection between the two things, and they no longer would salivate. So our perception is very, very strong, and it does influence our reaction to events. So when we're thinking about bad things that are happening to us, when we're feeling fearful about certain things, a lot of that is driven by our perception and our brain being a predictive mechanism to predict what is actually going to happen. Not necessarily the case, not always true, but that does influence our reaction to events. And the interesting thing that happens in the brain is when you're feeling anxious and feeling fearful, whether that's real or perceived, so whether the threat is real or something that's just in your mind, your brain sees it as exactly the same thing. So in the brain, the neurons are covered in what's called a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is kind of a fatty layer that then wraps around the neurons. And it's basically a protective mechanism, and it feeds them. And it helps you to build neural connections. What's interesting is as your experiences through life continue, those neural connections are built based on your perception of whether something is good or bad. And so with our brains naturally scanning for threat, we tend to build more of those negative neurons and that negativity bias, because our brain is trying to protect us. And so it's building these myelin sheaths and these neural connections and reinforcing them and making them thicker and stronger as we experience bad things. So the key to think about is how we can build the myelin sheath around positive connections. How can we build neural connections that are optimistic? And you can actually physically build these if you focus on the right things and if you focus on the positive. It's training your brain to actually be more optimistic. Because we can't really believe everything we think. Our brains are there to save our lives. That's their only function. Their function is to protect us. So the brain loves worrying. The brain loves to worry because it feels very familiar. It feels comfortable. And the brain feels that it's doing its job. So the worry cycle is very, very strong in the brain. You've also got something called the amygdala. So the amygdala is two tiny little almond-shaped nuclei just in the center of your brain, right by the hypothalamus. So it's very close to the learning center of the brain, which is unfortunate because it teaches us that things are bad a lot of the time. But the amygdala is our very, very primitive brain. And the amygdala teaches us that everything is a threat. It sees things as threats. It's constantly scanning. It's very emotional. So this is where we feel our emotions. This is where we feel anger, fear, joy, happiness, sadness. It's also about self-preservation. So it's a very, very, very critical part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, which wraps around the brain, developed much later than the amygdala. This is the logical or reasoning side of the brain. It's about self-control. Now, the interesting thing about the amygdala, I don't know if anyone can relate, but you know, when you really just want that cookie so much, you really just got to have that cookie because you've had a long day, it's been really tough. That's the amygdala. Your amygdala is telling you you want the cookie. It's all about instant gratification. The amygdala wants to give you absolutely everything you want, even if it's bad for you. The prefrontal cortex is your logical reasoning brain that's going to say, you know what? You've been on this diet for a while. You've been feeling good. You've been doing well. You're trying not to eat sugar. Do we really want that? Don't think so. Maybe not. These two pieces of the brain work together, but often they actually work counter to each other. And what happens when we're under stress is the amygdala can take over. So the amygdala can basically hijack the brain, shuts down the prefrontal cortex. And that's when we make bad decisions, or we just become overly emotional, or we react very strongly to a situation, usually in a way that is not necessary. We don't necessarily need to react the way we do, but because our reasoning brain has taken the day off and our emotional brain is fully in control, we're gonna take, we're gonna have a temper tantrum. So it's something to think about when you feel yourself in those situations where maybe you're wanting to yell at your kids, or scream at your husband or your wife, or or your boss is driving you crazy and you just want to slam your fist on the table. That's your amygdala wanting to let you have a tantrum. And so the important thing to think about is, where are you allowing your amygdala to take over? And how can you bring your prefrontal cortex back into the mix by calming yourself down and by understanding that it's not a logical response to the situation? So one of the main things that we talk about with the amygdala is fear. The amygdala is the fear center of your brain. It is terrified of everything. So we need to build fear resilience. Not an easy thing to do, but it can be done, and it can be trained, and you can overcome fear. Again, as we talked earlier about, just disassociate the things that are causing the fear, and also by thinking about how you can train your prefrontal cortex to stay online and calm your amygdala at the same time. I love this quote: "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." It's always the case. So often, we're terrified to try something. We're terrified to do something because our brains are telling us about all the bad things that could happen, everything that could possibly go wrong. But the reality is, if we do it, if we take action, in spite of the fear, so often what we discover is incredible. So how do we do this? How do we even break this fear thing? Let's talk about the worry loop. So I like to think of the worry loop as something akin to a roller coaster ride. So I'm sure we can all relate to this. So we have this trigger, stress. Something's happening, making us worry. When that happens, we get on the roller coaster ride. The amygdala kicks in, frontal lobe shuts down because the frontal lobe's like, you know what, I just don't have the energy for this. Amygdala, you take over. We start to worry. We ruminate. We think about things. We chew on things. We constantly just reinforce those stressful thoughts and behaviors. As we do this, we actually get rewarded for it. In a weird way, we get rewarded. Now, if you were going to worry about something, let's say you were terrified about doing a presentation to a customer, for example. You worry about it. Maybe you decide, I'm not going to do it today because I've got other things going on. You're avoiding it. So the reward of the behavior, in this case, which is worry and avoidance, is that you don't have to go through the negative emotion of the fear of having the presentation to be done. Now, the interesting thing with this worry loop is it does reward our brains because, again, this is fuel for our amygdala. The amygdala loves worry. And our brain's figuring, I'm doing my job. We're worrying about this. This is good. It, however, takes an incredible amount of energy. It saps the energy from your brain, and it really, really tires you out. And your brain is like a battery. It doesn't have infinite resources. So the more you worry and ruminate on something, the more you end up depleting your energy reserves, and the less able you are to stop worrying. It's such a vicious cycle. So to break the worry loop, when the trigger happens, when you're stressed about something and you start to worry about it, then, I recommend try something. Get curious. Instead of being worried and just getting into the emotion, take a look at the emotion, label it. What is causing the worry? What is the emotion? Is it fear? Is it anxiety? Is it anger? What is the behavior that's driving your emotion? And then ask, how rewarding is this for me? How am I being rewarded by being in this worry loop? And then ask, what is the bigger, better option? What's a better way to handle this issue than just sitting in this worry loop? And then you apply the antidote to it. You anticipate what the issue is bringing. So let's say there's a situation that you're anticipating being bad. What is the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? What's the most likely scenario? If you can get curious about exploring these things rather than just being immersed in the feeling of fear, Then you start to apply the antidote to the worry loop, and you can break that worry loop. It doesn't mean you're not thinking about it, but you're thinking about it using that prefrontal cortex. You're activating it because it's now more logical, and you're looking for a plan and an action. And the action is what is the antidote to fear. So when we have fear, it freezes us. Fear always brings us to a place of being frozen. If we apply curiosity to it, take some of that fear away, we can start to move. And the action that you take, whatever that is, and it might just be the action is to think about how you're going to apply the action. Whatever the action is that you take, that will cut the fear cycle. It actually steps in front of that fear cycle. So it's a really nice way to think about how you deal with rumination and worry. Because as I said, this is one of the things that is the most depleting for our brains. Fear has a shelf life. So Randy Pausch was a professor at Carnegie Mellon. I don't know, you may have heard of him. He did something called the last lecture. He died several years ago, and he gave a really powerful last lecture to his students. And one of the things he talked about was this whole anticipation of the bad things. And he mentioned that when he was dealing with whatever he was dealing with, and of course, in particular, his cancer, he would talk about, is he being eaten by wolves or not? So when he was dealing with a problem, he would look at it just to decide whether, if things went really badly, worst case scenario, would he really get eaten by wolves? And the chances are, and the chances were, and the chances still are, absolutely not. He's not going to get eaten by wolves. But he's helping his brain to think about the fact that there are possibilities and that there are solutions to the problem. He's overcoming the fear of the wolf, which is basically what's going to freeze him, by understanding the fact that it's not the worst case scenario. And then he also understood that fear has a shelf life. So if you can sit with a fear for a little while, it's usually around, the peak of fear is about 10 to 15 minutes. And then it starts to subside. If you've ever been, somewhere where maybe I have a horrible fear of spiders, for example. So my husband was away, and there was this big spider in the kitchen, and of course now my wolf was, the spider's going to murder me, it's going to kill me, right? So I'm like now looking for ways to inflict pain on the spider without necessarily being anywhere near it. And eventually I stood with the spider for about 15 minutes. I'm not sure who was more afraid, me or the spider. I suspect the spider was more frightened of me. But eventually my fear peaked and then started to subside, because I started to think, worst case scenario, the spider runs away, I can't catch it. Best case scenario, I grab the spider, I get it outside, all is well. Most likely scenario, probably that. And that is exactly what happened. But I had to overcome my fear. Otherwise, I would have been in the bedroom and locked the kitchen door and waited for my husband to get home. So it has a shelf life. It takes practice, but it takes taking action. Do the thing you fear. It's so, so important, because as you do that, you start to extinguish that fear. It's quite interesting because fear drives cortisol production, and so it builds that stress hormone. If you're fearful of doing something, the more you do it, the less stress hormone is produced, and you start to then become more habituated and more calm. And that is an incredible thing when you think about how you can overcome any kind of obstacle in your life. It's not the absence of fear, right? Courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing it in spite of it. Know that the intensity is temporary. It's there and you'll feel it, but it's temporary. So if you can hold on, you can get through. And finally, the antidote to fear is action. Randy also talked about this notion of brick walls being there for a reason. He said those walls are there to test us, to help us to get over them, to help build us as human beings, to build our strength and our endurance, and to make our hearts brave. This is a framework that I like to use, and I always encourage all of my clients to use this when you're dealing with something that's just really making things difficult for you. And the whole idea behind this is to really think about paying attention to what's happening to you and what is the thing that's triggering you, putting you in a state of fear or putting you in a state of anger or just sadness. And we often will say, well, of course I know why I'm sad or why I'm angry. But if you really think about it, then often you'll find that there's so much underneath that that's driving your perception of what the emotion is doing to you. So if you can pay attention to it, identify what it is, observe your response. Now, generally, when we're in a heightened state of stress, we're in a protect response. So our blood vessels are constricted. We're maybe breathing a little more shallowly. We might have the hand issues. We might have cold, clammy hands. The heart might be beating a little bit more rapidly. Observe it, but observe it without judgment. Where are you? What is putting you in this space? And then acknowledge the emotion, recognize the emotion. And what's key to this is to label it. If you're feeling anxious, you're feeling anxious. There's nothing wrong with that. It's completely legit emotion. Doesn't mean you're an anxious person. You are not the emotion. And you're not ruled by the emotion. You're labeling the emotion because it's important to acknowledge it. Challenge your thoughts. Often there are assumptions you might be making about the situation you're in, about what that person said or what your husband meant when he said that thing. What's driving those assumptions? If you really start to be honest and think about it, can you really validate your assumptions? Is it your perception? Are you making up stories? We all do this. Our brains are story makers. We make up stories in our heads. What's rewarding to you about avoiding the situation? What's rewarding to you about staying in this emotion? Because we are rewarded by this at some level. Then look for your motivation. Can you reframe the threat, because your brain is seeing whatever the situation is as a threat, as a challenge? Can you make it more of a positive? What are the positive aspects of this thing? What can you gain from facing your fear? You'll notice that you start to change your physiology at this point, from a protect response to a courage response. When you start to think about it logically and a little less emotionally, but also with compassion and empathy for your emotions, you start to open up your blood vessels and your body goes into the courage response, which is where you start to be ready to take action. And then think about what's in the bounds of your control. What resources do you have to deal with your fear? Who can support you? Leaning on the people around you who can support you in overcoming it. What actions will you take to extinguish your fear? And then what emotion do you feel now that you have a plan? So it helps you to move through this whole process of thinking through a situation that's causing you to feel fear or causing you to feel anger or sadness or upset, most of which are rooted in fear. To build fear resistance, or resilience rather, I think of this in a small little acronym called WHOOP. So WHOOP, the W is the wish. What is the wish? What do you want to overcome? What is the thing that you want to say, I did that. I knocked that out of the park. Yeah, I got it right. I changed. I did whatever I needed to do. The O is outcome. It's very important that you envision a positive outcome and specifically how that will feel, because the feeling is often what drives the emotion and the feeling can often drive the response. So envision a positive outcome. How will it feel when you hit that out of the park, when you do what you want to do? Look at the obstacles. It's important to be realistic. Acknowledge that it will be hard. There was a test that was done, a study done several years ago, where there were a whole group of participants who were looking to lose weight. And they'd been looking to lose weight for a long time, had been doing very well. They were divided into two groups. And the researchers gave them a huge, big bowl of M&Ms to the one group and said, so here's the deal. If you want to lose weight, you have to, not eat these M&Ms. And we want to know whether you think you can do this. And so the first group said, been doing so well, been doing fantastically. I think we've got this. Not a problem. We're on it. It's easy. We're going great guns. Perfect. Second group, they said, okay, well, so here's your bowl of M&Ms. Now we know that you shouldn't be eating them, but they're there if you want them. So how do you think you're doing with your weight loss challenge? And so the second group said, well, done well, doing well, feeling good about it, but it's hard. It's going to be tough. It's difficult. It's not going to be easy to overcome the desire for M&Ms, especially at like 3 p.m. I'm tired and the kids are going crazy and the husband's going crazy. And I just really just want some M&Ms. I want some sugar. It's going to be tough. What was interesting about these two groups is that the first group, when they were left alone with the M&Ms, ate 75% more M&Ms than the group that acknowledged that there was going to be a difficult journey. So you have to be realistic about acknowledging the challenge in overcoming the thing that you're trying to overcome. Look for the obstacles and be prepared for those obstacles and acknowledge that it's difficult because we're all human and we have to have self-compassion, knowing that sometimes we are going to fall off the wagon. And then finally, plan is the last piece of group. Use an if-then plan to take action. So super, super important that you have a plan. If I don't go to the gym this week, then what am I going to do? Or if I wake up and I really don't feel like getting out of bed to go to hot yoga tomorrow, okay, well then I'm going to jump out of bed and do 10 sit-ups. I hate sit-ups, hate them. So I know if I don't do the hot yoga, I'm going to punish myself with the sit-ups. I also know that if I get to the point where I don't want to get up and get dressed, then I will have my clothes ready to go in the morning. I'll put them out. I'll pre-plan to make sure that challenge is going to be easier for me. So whenever something is difficult to do, make it 20 seconds easier. So if you're getting ready to go to work out or do something, put your clothes out first. So you don't have to think about the decision of what to put on. Make it easy. Take the if-then plan into action. So all these different things help you to think about the challenge, the outcome, and then the plan, which will help you to get to the goal. The other thing that's interesting is tapping into the dopamine pathway. Now, dopamine is an interesting, very, very interesting neurochemical. It's about anticipation. So dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. It's basically a satisfaction chemical in doing something. So it taps into your frontal lobe and it makes it feel really, really pleased that you've hit that to-do list. You've got that thing done. You've taken care of that problem that you need to take care of. So it's very, very, very strong neurochemical. Language drives a lot of the dopamine pathway. So we tend to use a language of obligation. We tend to talk about the fact that we should, I need to, I have to. When we do this, when we talk about when we use the language of obligation, we tend to have a bit more of a lack of choice. And our brain starts to think, I'm being forced to do this. It's stressful. I don't really want to do it. If we can change that and turn that around to the language of choice, so instead of I should, say I want to. Instead of saying I should lose weight, I want to lose weight. Instead of saying, I need to, go to the gym, I get to go to the gym. There's choice here. Instead of saying I have to take my children to daycare. I choose to take my children to daycare. So there's a lot of choice built into the language that we use in our heads that then helps us to tap into this dopamine pathway. And it's incredible to feel when you have choice and you have some form of autonomy, your brain gets energy from that. When you're feeling like you're being pressured into doing something, it just makes it much, much more difficult for your brain to cope, and it depletes your brain's energy and causes stress. The language of choice takes down cortisol. Language of obligation pushes it up. Because often when we think about stress, it's a disconnect between the amount of obligation we feel and the perceived resources we believe we have. Language of choice helps you not necessarily to change the amount of obligation we feel, but it does help us to see that we have resources because we're making a choice. And finally, when we're thinking about fear, knowing that hope is stronger than fear. So hope is a fascinating emotion. It's the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. And it's the belief that I have the power to make it so. And so that is so important to hold on to when you're in that place of fear, because hope and fear cannot coexist. It's not possible. And so hope can be that fuel to help you to step forward and take action. Distractions. Distractions are all around us. Willpower is exhaustible. Willpower is like a battery. Our brain operates on willpower, and it is exhaustible. We know that the brain uses 10 times the energy of your body. Your willpower is what you use to stay focused, to hold that shopping list in your brain, your short-term memory, to listen to others without drifting off. All of that is about tuning out distractions, and all of that is based on willpower. But it's not an inexhaustible resource. So we have to create space to truly be present in order to maintain our willpower battery and to recharge it. Now, the interesting thing about our conscious brain is it can handle 120 bits of information per second. That's how much it can process. That's not a lot. What's fascinating is that the unconscious brain can process 1 million bits of information per second. So when it comes to distractions, everything that's in our conscious brain is moving through it, and we can't hold on to a lot of it. But when something becomes unconscious, if it becomes a habit, it goes into this lovely repertoire of resources and skills that we have to deal with pretty much anything. So you have to decide to preserve energy. Anything that you can do that you want to create a habit of doing, anything that's good that you want to use to continue to make your life stronger, has to become something that's unconscious. So that is, anything that taxes your brain, decision-making taxes your brain. That comes out of 120 bits of information per second. What to have for breakfast. I have oatmeal for breakfast every morning. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to make a decision. Just go into the kitchen, make the oatmeal, do my thing, chop up the banana, done. I don't have to use any of that brain space to make that decision, because I can save my brain space for other decisions during the day that are in my conscious brain. So anything that you can do to habitize any things that are decision making, what to wear the next day. Can you put out your clothes the night before so you don't have to think about it? You don't just stand there looking at your closet. So there's a lot of ways that you can pre-decide to look at ways to preserve your energy in your brain. One of the ways of doing this is to start with a morning ritual. So the mornings are such a precious part of our day. And I always encourage people to think about starting the day with a ritual. Focus on what feeds you. Don't look at social media. Please don't look at your email. Read something interesting, meditate, do some good breathing, follow the sun. If you can then go outside and have natural light on your eyes for between 2 and 10 minutes in the morning, it activates your brain, and it wakes you up. It basically switches off your melatonin, wakes up your brain, and says, good morning, it's time to go get moving. So it's a great way to start the day if you can. And waste time well. Focus on using the time in the morning for what nourishes you and makes you feel good. A lot of people try a 20-minute meditation. They might just, listen to some nice music. They might just read a book that they love. just spend time having a cup of coffee with a loved one. So many things that you can do, but really nice to open your day with a strong morning ritual. Then we need to focus on attention. So attention is interesting. We know that willpower is exhaustible, but attention is a superpower. So you can use your attention if you focus it in the right way. Mindfulness also does something around pain. So it increases your pain threshold. It's really fascinating. And it also builds the gray matter in your hippocampus. So it helps you to learn. So anything that you can do to help your brain become more mindful and more calm is fantastic for learning and great for your brain. Few things that you can think about here. Do the hard stuff first. So do the difficult tasks early in the morning. Even if you're not a morning person, your brain generally likes things done that are more difficult earlier in the day. Practice strategic ignorance, as I mentioned. Stay away from the distractions like social media, all of those things that can just really just derail your day and frankly are just not adding any value to your day. Batch, don't dip. So let's say, for example, you've got your email inbox open, you've got some we're all looking at screens all day. You've got some windows open, you're doing your thing. If you constantly dip into your email and you're constantly dipping into other things, and then you're writing an article, and then you're doing a presentation, and then you're getting on a call, you're switching tasks all the time. Multitasking is not a possibility for our brains. It's physically incapable of doing it. So it's switching tasks. That's so fatiguing for your brain. So I encourage you to think about batching, not dipping. So batch your email. Do your email maybe for 20 minutes, a couple of times a day. Do similar tasks together. If you're writing stuff, write all the stuff you need to write together in a batch so that your brain is not overtaxed and is not trying to switch gears. It also helps you to stay in flow, which it makes you much more creative, and you can solve problems a lot more strategically. Use your energy cycles. So if you are the kind of person who has a lot of energy later in the day, well, great, then maybe work on that presentation a little later in the day. If you are the kind of person who goes into a dip at the end of the day, that's probably the best time to do something that's not as cognitively stressful, like email, or even maybe checking that social media occasionally. But again, if you do it in energy cycles and you batch and don't dip, you'll find that you're much more effective, you're much more productive, and you don't feel as fatigued and scattered at the end of the day. Your brain has to have that kind of structure and framework. And finally, take brain breaks. We all need these breaks. So if you're in meetings or you're doing something, do it for an hour, do your email, do your presentation, do your meetings for an hour, and then take a break. And take a break completely. Step away for 15 minutes. Step outside, take a walk. So you switch from sort of the intellectual task and the cognitive task that you're doing, and you switch to a more creative mind-wandering mode. And that will enable your brain to recharge a little of its energy and then come back to whatever it is you're working on after a break. So brain breaks are super, super important. Something that a lot of organizations are now building into their ways of working. They're actually working on, in some cases, where from 9 to 12 in the morning, no meetings, no calls, it's just flow time. So every employee has an opportunity to work on the stuff they really want to work on, focus, and nobody's going to interrupt them and disturb them, nobody in the company. And then from 12 till 4, then it's meetings and emails and all of that good stuff. And it's incredible the power that this has, because it helps the brain to use its energy in the right way, and it doesn't fatigue people, and the creativity that comes as a result is incredible. So I encourage you to think about that in your own world. How can you build those breaks in so that you can take advantage of flow, so that you can then get the best out of whatever it is you're doing? And I guarantee you, if you're not multitasking and you're not jumping around, you'll get it done quicker, faster, and better than you would if you tried the other way. The other thing that helps incredibly when it comes to distractions is to focus on the good. As I mentioned earlier, our brains are always focused on the negative. They're very, very twitchy, but they definitely want to see the feeling of wonder is one of those things that is like fuel to the brain. And so optimism is really a choice. We had I think it was 2012, University of Kentucky had a study, and they had people intentionally notice the good. So they would write in a journal, gratitude journal, talk about good things that happened to them. And they would, look for moments of wonder. So they would then, recall moments where they had that tingly feeling, those goosebumps, when you're looking at the Grand Canyon for the first time, or something just equally beautiful. You get that feeling of being small, but still being part of something big. That's wonder. So they had this group cultivate wonder, and they actually built new neural pathways. We talked about that myelin sheath and those neural connections. Wonder will help you physically build new connections. So as you use those pathways and you start to notice the good and train your brain to notice the good, those neural connections start to become stronger and become more ingrained, and your brain starts to naturally go to the good. So look outward and look at, beyond yourself. Avoiding the scarcity mindset is so important as well. This is gratitude. Being appreciative of all the things that we have. Gratitude journaling is incredibly powerful if you do this 15 minutes before you go to bed every night. Just write down something you're grateful for. Then you can review your list at the end of the week. It does wonders for your brain. It's also incredibly good for your mood. And it's fun if you share with other people. I have families who do this together. And it's a lovely bonding moment because you start to appreciate the good in your life. And find the extraordinary in the ordinary. So it's really important to think about what's incredible in your life and focus on it. So not all storms come to disrupt your life. Some come to clear your path. And if we can see that, then we can really understand that the challenge is just there to be overcome. And we have the capability and the possibility to do so. So to nurture our recovery from stress, we want to grow our brain fertilizer. We want to move as much as we can. Get outside, green spaces, so important. Get on your feet as much as you can. Sitting really is the new smoking. So as much as you can move on your feet, it does incredibly good things for your brain. It feeds your brain. Your brain needs that oxygen. It needs exercise. It needs movement. And watch your posture. Our posture is also really important for the way we breathe and the way we feel. It can have a huge impact on our mood and on our stress response when we're actually focused on posture. Food is medicine. Amp up the green produce. If you can just add one more green produce to your diet, that will do wonders for your brain, ideally something organic. Omegas, fish or flax, the omega-3s are incredibly important for your brain. It runs on omega. It needs it to nourish it. So if you can do anything to increase your omegas, that's incredibly beneficial. Obviously, water is incredibly important. And what's even more important is please treat sugar like a recreational drug. It's poison. Sugar is not good for you. I don't care if it's honey. I don't care if it's agave. I don't care if it's sugar. I don't care. And I won't even get to talk about sweeteners. Sweeteners, just please don't do it. Sugar is a recreational drug. Have it occasionally, but know that it's not good for your body and it's very, very bad for your brain. Sleep is super important. You want to sleep like a caveman. Sleep is one of the most restorative things we can do for our brains. It's also the most restorative thing we can do for our bodies, and especially when we're under stress. And that makes it doubly difficult because we tend to sleep less when we're under stress. So a couple of things that you can do to make sleep a little more easy to come by. Clear the clutter in your bedroom. Don't have stuff on your nightstand, books, your phone, or bits of paper. Your brain goes, look at me, I need to do something with that. Clear the clutter, make it a very clear, quiet zone. Go to the dark side. Keep it as dark as you possibly can. The artificial light that we have is wreaking havoc with our systems because we work on light. That's how our brains actually work. So keep your bedroom as dark as you possibly can so that you start to emulate sunrises and sunsets so that your brain knows it needs to go to sleep. You want to be cool. You want to be about between 64 and 67 degrees in your bedroom. So you want it a little cooler than maybe you'd think, because your body temperature naturally needs to drop when you're sleeping. Please banish blue light. Please don't look at your phone before you go to bed. That means no devices, no TV, no Palm Pilots or whatever those things are. Please banish blue light as much as you can. Blue light actually switches off our melatonin, and it causes our brains to want to wake up. It thinks it's sunshine. And so that really makes sleep so difficult to come by. So at least an hour before you go to bed, before your bedtime itself, banish the blue light, switch off the TV, put down the phone, and start to dim the lights, and you'll start to feel more like sleeping. And finally, building strong connections, strong social connections. So important to nurture recovery. Lean on other people. And it's so important to have positive connections with people around you that you love. There's nothing more nurturing and nothing more powerful for our sense of connection than spending time with people that you love and care for. And rather than giving people a piece of our mind, let's see about if we can give them a little bit of our hearts. So incredibly powerful to do. And so finally, the only last thing I'll leave you with, because I know we want to have a couple of minutes for questions, is the notion of the wanderer. So this is one of the most important things you can do for any stress, for any anxiety, for any fear. Breathe. All breaths are not created equal. Breathing is so important. The vagus nerve is the wanderer. So the vagus nerve starts just up here by your brainstem, and there are two that they run down the back of your spine, and they then radiate out into every part of the body. So it touches every organ. And it's called the wanderer for that reason. Now, if you can activate the wanderer, it activates your parasympathetic nervous system. So it shuts down your cortisol response. It calms your amygdala. So you can actually shrink the size of your amygdala with meditation over time. So you actually have less tendency to get hit up, to get emotional, to be upset, to get angry. You become more calm. And that's the wanderer at work. And one of the best ways of activating the wanderer is by belly breathing. So you inhale deeply, and belly breathing, not chest breathing. You want to feel your belly breathe into the count of 3, exhale to the count of 6. And just do this for a few minutes. And you can do it wherever you are and multiple times during the day to activate that wanderer. You can also meditate. Meditation is been proven to be highly effective in leveraging the vagus nerve and tapping into the parasympathetic system and calming your brain. A good laugh, a good belly laugh does this too, and as does singing. So hey, belt out your favorite tune and sing like no one's listening. All of these things do wonderful things for getting the vagus nerve to help you out when you're feeling a little bit more stressed than you'd like to be. And I'll leave you with this, that all of these things are there to help you to deal with what you're dealing with day to day. But know that you are human, and this takes practice. Resilience isn't something you just switch on or switch off. It's practice. It's a lifelong practice, and it's something that you take what works for you and you try it. And if it doesn't, you try something else. So have self-compassion. Know that sometimes it may not work for you. Sometimes you are going to lose your temper or be afraid or just feel down, and that's okay. Because self-compassion is probably the biggest gift you can give yourself. So with that, I believe we may have a minute for questions.
That was really great, Tracey. Thank you so much. I have taken 6 pages of notes. Clearly, I needed this. I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation, and I know we are at a point for questions. So please put them in the chat. I do have a couple already that I'm going to read off to you, Tracey. Yes. From somebody on our staff, the question is, do you ever find that acknowledging the challenge would increase the worry loop? I love this question.
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
It can, but it's what's interesting about acknowledging the challenge is that you are doing it in the context of what you want to do as an action. So if you are, because the interesting thing is our brains do have a tendency to worry if we're not worrying. We get worried about not being worried. So when you are consciously thinking about the fact that this is going to be difficult, let's say, I'm trying to not eat donuts, and I love donuts. And I know that there's a bowl of donuts that I walk past every day, and it's going to be really tough for me to resist. Although I am using the worry loop to examine that challenge and the difficulty of the challenge, by doing that, I'm actually freeing myself up to say, it's okay. I'm giving myself self-compassion. I'm saying it's okay that it's difficult. Because otherwise, why is it even worth doing? So yes, you can get into a loop with that, but know that examining that and being honest with yourself about how difficult it is doesn't necessarily negate your ability to do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. It's such an interesting, I mean, everything that you're sharing with us today, Tracey, it's so practical. And I think in many ways, I always say we have the answers already. It's just a matter of being reminded that these things are happening and why they're happening.
Yeah.
When you started to talk about some of the health and wellness tips of sleep and diet, nutrition, and things of that nature, you talked about sugar. I love how you spoke to that because, it's something that I struggle with even in trying to educate my kids as to the dangers and the perils of sugar at a young age and getting into those habits now and how that, takes into your adult years. Yes. There was a great question from Jessie, which is, she hears you on sugar, but what about, and I say this all the time, what about that perfect little bite size of dark chocolate at 3 p.m. Sometimes that gives you just a little boost besides like having a cup of coffee. Yes. But what are your thoughts on dark chocolate in general for the sugar comment?
Dark chocolate is good. I think it has to, you'll want it to be at least 75% cocoa. Mm-hmm. So you want very good quality dark chocolate. Now, okay, I'm not saying you could never have sugar. I'm saying, well, have sugar, but when you do have sugar, choose the sugar you're having. So if you're choosing a very nice, very good quality small block of dark chocolate, which has incredible amount of antioxidants in it and is actually very good for your brain, that's absolutely fine because you're choosing to leverage the good in that, which is balancing out some of the bad, which is the sugar. But it's naturally lower in sugar, so it's good.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Phew.
Yeah. just don't eat the whole slab, okay?
Don't eat the whole thing. That would be my problem. Are omega supplements, another really great question, are omega supplements as effective as getting omega from your food?
Yes. Okay. And the reason is that our food system has been so depleted. So, if you have a couple of issues with fish. Obviously, you have the contamination of mercury and all that kind of thing to deal with. That being said, fish is still very good for you and very healthy, and you should eat it if you like fish. But you don't necessarily get the amount of omega that we need from the food system. It's the same with all vitamins. I supplement pretty much everything just because I know that the food system is so depleted, like spinach. I know I'm not getting the amount of iron out of a bowl of spinach that I would have gotten 75 years ago. It's just the soils are depleted. It's the same with fish. Obviously, if you are going to try to get most of your omega from fish or from flax seeds or from oils, great. But I would say they are good quality ones are just as effective because it's just basically allowing your system to top up on those areas that you might be struggling with. I had a friend who had she was having really bad mood swings. She was angry with everybody. She was throwing things. And she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And the psychiatrist wanted to put her onto medication. She didn't want to go to medication because she was training to be a pilot. So she wouldn't be able to qualify if she was, on medication. So she went onto a fish oil regimen, high quality fish oil, gargantuan amounts of it. Solved the problem. Never had an issue since.
Wow.
So it's a powerful thing if you apply it the right way. Also for, a lot of people who suffer from ADHD or any kind of attention issues and energy deficits, that can help a lot.
Mm, okay. Great to know. Again, such practical tips. I just can't thank you enough, Tracey. Thank you so much for joining us, for offering these wonderful solutions, quite honestly. And I know we will be taking this recording and making sure that everyone has a chance to refresh their knowledge with you. And how do people get in touch with you, Tracey, for future engagements? I know you come in and you do talk to large organizations, teams, and you help bring resilience training to leaders. But how can people get in touch with you should they want to follow up?
Sure. So you can see my contact details there. So feel free to reach out. Would be delighted to talk to anybody. I could talk about this stuff all day. It's so fascinating, and we're constantly learning new things too. So it's an evolving science, which is fantastic. So happy to chat to anybody who'd like to reach out. Also, if you are interested in the book, know that you also have access to the mobile app, which allows you to sort of take some of these ideas and some of the concepts from the book along with you. And I add information and little exercises and things to the app as well, which are always fun to play with. So yeah, and happy to talk about any doing any engagements or dealing with anybody who would like some more support and more help and more information.
Thank you so much. And I will give a plug to the book. I purchased a copy for my team. I believe in every word written in this book. It is a masterpiece. It really is. And I go back and I refer to it as I know you have others that do as well. So, okay, everybody, Taming the Sabertooth, Tracey Grove. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Tracey, thank you. And we'll see you guys at the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.